Okay, well, first, okay, we have Dan Piper from Socialist Resurgence, who is running for state rep, Connecticut state rep from, was it the first district of Hartford? Yeah,
Oh,
sorry, go on.
it's in Hartford, First District of Connecticut. Yes.
Okay, good. Yeah, I believe we may have met. I think we met at the Trotsky School. Was it a year and a half ago now? Yeah. Oh,
Yeah.
yeah.
In December, or yes, that sounds about right. Yes.
About a little over a year ago. Yeah, I remember that. Okay, great. Okay, so now you are running against. First, you're in a Democratic Party controlled state. Governor Lamont is a Democrat, and the guy you're running against is Matt Ritter. He's a Democrat.
Mm-hmm.
He's the
Mm-hmm.
incumbent. Now, what are the issues? As interesting issues about opening up the state. They're really pushing the state to open up and the schools to open up. How is that going?
Well, yeah, there are more issues than
That's
just
yeah.
about anyone can keep track of. I mean,
Sure, sure.
yeah, when I talk to people, they say I don't know where to start. Um, so on the one hand, there's fighting for all the services that people need. So I just went to a demonstration last night organized by immigrants fighting for healthcare rights, because if you are undocumented, you don't necessarily get healthcare. You might get it through your job if you have a job that provides some kind of healthcare, but there's plenty of people who don't have healthcare through their job, and so they're fighting for that. And especially in the midst of the pandemic, it's obviously extremely important. But it's a fight that we would be having if there was not a pandemic, and we will be having after the pandemic.
Of
In
course.
terms of the reopening, Lamont has been pushing for a long time to get the private for-profit economy humming the way it pretty much normally did, in the midst of the pandemic.
Right.
And the thing is, Connecticut was hit really hard at the beginning of this in April and May, March, April, and May. And over 4,000 people died. And so people have been quite reluctant to go forward with all the measures that Lamont has been putting through. So, for instance, he did allow restaurants to reopen and other such businesses, but and have people eat in person, which has not yet happened, for instance, in New York. But people are not going back in the numbers that he wants. They're not going back into the restaurants. A lot of the restaurants are not opening for indoor service. A lot of workers are remaining unemployed rather than going back to work in dangerous conditions. Although a lot of people obviously still are working in dangerous conditions. And the rate has not been nearly as high as it has been around the rest of the country, but it is much higher than in other industrialized countries and even much poorer countries throughout the world. So we had 140 people die in this small state of 3.5 million in just July and August from the coronavirus. And Lamont is now reopening the schools. And so there's been dozens of cases in schools where, someone's been identified as having COVID-19. And Lamont's approach to that has been it's kind of a divide and conquer strategy. What he said is everybody gets to do what they want to do. So each district gets to decide whether they open or not, whether it's hybrid or not, what way they open. Each parent decides whether or not their kid goes into school or stays remote. And what does that all mean in actual practice? It means, for instance, that the districts where there's a lower rate of COVID-19 feel more comfortable to go more in person. It means that parents who are less vulnerable to the virus feel more comfortable going in person, or parents who have the ability to pay for a tutor and put their kid in a learning pod, they go full remote and they don't go in person. And so it means that it's like everyone is kind of every person for themselves, every district for themselves. The districts actually compete in a lot of ways because there are charter schools, because there are magnet schools. So if you're in a magnet school, your money is dependent upon whether or not you get as enough students enrolled in your school. And so if you lose students, you can immediately lose students to the home district if those parents want a different plan than what you're offering. And so every district is sort of trying to accommodate everybody. And there's no state plan or support to actually fight this thing. And it's up to every district, every school, every classroom now to make sure that they actually carry out procedures that are not going to reopen a pandemic.
Right.
And just what this really does, and at the end of the day, is that you're requiring that children become responsible for preventing the pandemic opening in their schools, because there isn't enough testing, there isn't enough tracing, and the cases are starting to go up. In all the news reports, they say even though the cases have gone up, they've actually doubled since about a month ago. We have not yet begun to see the effects of reopening the schools in the state. And even though that's all true, even though the rate has doubled, we expect a greater increase in the coming weeks. Lamont is still planning on expanding reopening of restaurants and now opening movie theaters and things like that. And just to get a perspective on what all this means, his limit for what kind of rate of infection he is comfortable with before he starts reversing the reopening, he has a limit on this. And it's 24 new infections for every 100,000 per day. And there are only 8 days in this pandemic when Connecticut has had a higher number than that. In other words, Lamont is ready to go to basically the most extreme point of the pandemic in Connecticut's history, and take measures that bring us to that rate. And only then will he consider closing things down again. And of course, then the pandemic spreads from there. But that's really, I don't know, that's kind of a summary for you, I guess.
Right. Interesting. Thanks. So what would be a socialist alternative to this? How do you think we should handle something like the pandemic, or the reopening or the closing? What would be an alternative?
Well, there's a lot of alternatives that have been pursued elsewhere. Unfortunately, they're really throughout the world, there are, basically all the governments of the world serve a capitalist class of one sort or another. So, and except for one exception, Cuba, which is, got its own limitations and so on and so forth. Sorry?
They've handled it better.
They have handled it better, yes. And most countries have handled it better. But, so I'm kind of I want to throw a caveat in here, which is that you can look at you can see that if you actually want to fight the virus, it's quite possible to do so. The main thing is that for decades, the United States has cut back its public health care system. And this has happened under both Democrats and Republicans. And this is partly a result of that. It is also, I think, a result of a deep rot in the American capitalist class that has produced all kinds of phenomena. Trump is just one of them. But, right now, if we were to get serious about fighting this, we could organize a shutdown where we actually close everything that does not materially need to be open for human need. So during the pandemic, Lamont and others kept manufacturing going. Even when they did quarantines, they kept construction going of luxury apartments. They kept the prisons closed. He didn't release anyone from prison for COVID reasons. And a socialist response would not be to do that. We would stop war production. We would stop construction of luxury apartments. We would let people out of prison to prevent pandemic from spreading through the prisons. And we could organize things on an emergency basis to make life more livable in quarantine conditions for a short period of time, right? We're not talking an extremely long period of time. So home delivery of food, for instance, instead of having to go to a big grocery store filled with people. That's the kind of thing you can do when you organize on the basis of human need rather than profit. And at the same time, we could ramp up production, testing of various kinds, organize lots of people into tracing, and when we reopen, we wouldn't be reopening for the basis of profit. So, for instance, having people eat inside a restaurant might be really important if the only way you can support yourself is by people coming into your restaurant and paying you to eat there. But there's no reason why that has to be the only means by which someone who owns a restaurant can live. So for instance, with schools, I mean, one of the ways we can deal with the pandemic, even if we don't get rid of the virus through quarantines and so on, if we don't actually get control on that, as has been done in New Zealand to a large extent, as was done in Vietnam, South Korea, many other countries, even China, even if we don't get a full control over the virus, education does not have to be done in a big building. The way education is done in this country and throughout the world, it's a very cheap way of, it's a form of childcare and it's a form of training new workers.
Right.
And to the extent that working people have won the right to actually a real education, it also is a way for people to have human development. It's a form of human development. But the priority has not been human development for a long time.
Yeah.
And if we were to prioritize human development in a pandemic situation, we wouldn't force children into a building with lots of other children who might be infected with a disease that might get their parents killed. I mean, that's not what we would do. You don't do that to children, right?
Right.
We can have learning pods for all, just as the upper middle class have, where you have a tutor. We've got about 150,000 unemployed people in Connecticut. 100,000 tutors would mean, and these could also include college students. There's about 200,000 college students, so on and so forth. So you got about 250, 300,000 people to work with here. Simply 100,000 of them would mean roughly learning pods of about 5 kids per pod.
Okay.
And, one tutor. Teachers can also teach in person in a small pod, but also do online. You could also have a different model for education. You could have a lot more project-based learning. You could have children involved in projects outdoors where they get to learn things about, there's lots of different activities you can do. I'm not going to get into all the details, but if we actually use imagination and we actually are not afraid to use the resources of the society that is hoarded by the rich, there's lots of things we could do that would be safe, or at least dramatically safer and less stressful for everybody, and that would actually involve more learning and more human development.
Right. Interesting. Very well thought out. You are a teacher yourself. What do you teach?
I teach English, 11th and 12th grade.
Okay. Are you doing hybrid learning or in-person learning or online?
I'm doing in-person learning. I teach in-person and online at the same time.
Okay, that's interesting. I work as a special ed teacher. We have like a hybrid
Oh.
system. Kids are there in school twice a week. The other 2 days they're at home, and we're closed on Wednesdays. So it's kind of working out more or less okay. I work with kids who have behavioral difficulties, and they're hanging on. But interesting. Okay, so you were running, yeah, you were running as a socialist. How do you explain what socialism is to people? Do you get people saying, well, socialism is when the government does stuff? How do you explain it to people?
Yeah, no, it's definitely not just when the government does stuff. The government does all kinds of things that are not socialism. Going to war to dominate another country is not socialism. The police arresting and harassing people is not socialism. Socialism comes from a basic objective reality that we face today in this country and in this world, which is that everything is produced socially. Like the computers that we're using to talk to each other, the clothing we're wearing, the books behind us, even the walls around us, they were not made by people we know personally. They were made all over the world. You could probably find labor from just about every country in the world in the materials that we're using for this interview today. However, while it's made by everyone in the world, it's owned by a tiny number of people, and the profits go to a tiny number of people. And the choices about how to produce these things and what to produce, all those choices are made by a tiny number of people. And that's the ruling class. That's the rich. That's the capitalist class. So that's a contradiction. And they use the state to solve that contradiction in their favor. They use the state to make sure that everybody's working for them, to keep everyone divided so that they don't actually get together. And what socialism is resolving that contradiction on the side of humanity and on the side of the people who actually produce everything. And the only way that can be resolved is if all of this stuff that we use to produce everything is owned in common by the people of the world and is managed in common by the people of the world, and not to produce profit, but to serve the needs of those who are producing. And so, yes, doing that means establishing a state, because you can't get there without establishing a state power that enforces the conditions where we can actually collectively own things. But the state is not the end in of itself. The state is one of the tools that is necessary along the way to make the common ownership of everything and the common collaboration a possibility. So that's my nutshell description,
Sure.
I suppose.
Sure. I was at a few months ago. I live in Maine, and Bath Iron Works was having a strike going on for a few months. I was up there with a few friends. We were trying to talk about socialism to people, and many of the employees, the striking workers, were Trump supporters. They were politically really conservative. I brought up the idea of workers' democracy, where socialism is workers controlling their own workplace instead of the bosses. That got some resonance with some people, but when you got beyond that, it was shut down really fast. Oh, Cuba, Venezuela, people just went nuts. So I found it is sort of difficult to convey it. There's so much ingrained hostility to the idea of socialism, unfortunately, among a lot of people. Have you been finding that?
I find there are significant differences depending on who you're talking to. I find that, and I found this from my own campaign, but also 2 years ago, I was the manager for the Fred Link's Senate campaign.
Right, right.
And in 2010, I was the manager for Chris Hutchinson's congressional campaign. So there's been big differences between 2010 and 2018, because I did collect thousands of signatures for both of those two campaigns. I only had to collect about 100 for mine, and I didn't even collect all of those. But I did collect at least 1,000 or 2,000 for the other two. And here's what I found, is that in the last one, and I found this also in other political activity and flyering for socialist events, people between ages of maybe 40 and 70, their response is often, I like everything you're talking about and what you stand for, but why do you have to say socialism? Or something along the lines of Cuba and Venezuela. Usually more is, why do you have to use the word socialism? Under 40, it gets a bit more mixed. Once you get down to between 14 and like 27, the response in favor of socialism is like unadulterated enthusiasm.
Right.
You know,
Okay.
I get more responses like, why did you start by talking about, healthcare and housing? Why didn't you start by saying socialist?
Right.
That's what you should have led with. I would have, been more interested if you said that. I also find too that African Americans, Puerto Ricans, Latinos are far more enthusiastic or interested or serious about the subject than white Americans. And women too are much more ready to talk about it than white men. So one of the more conservative towns we went to 2 years ago, Anfield, we found if you wanted to get a signature, you really should talk to the women, because the men weren't talking to us. And so I think there are these cleavages, right? And this has been set up, right? It's not exactly that surprising that the ruling class has done things to warp the consciousness of particularly white Americans and men. And I'm just reading The Color of Law and The Color of Money, these two books they're focused on the conditions of African Americans and how the state and big financial capital have restricted the abilities of African Americans and have reduced the wealth of African Americans. But the other side of the text, when you look at it, you think about the effect that all these policies have on white Americans. So Social Security, FDIC insured accounts, FHA loan-backed housing. I mean, all of these things created this existence for white Americans that others were legally excluded from. And not only that, but because of the way the FHA set up housing and set up housing values. I mean, they literally, they had a policy that inherently reduced the value of your home if you had African Americans living near you, because the federal government would not give guarantees to loans if your neighborhood had too many African Americans living in it. Mm. And so, and so that has a real effect on the consciousness of white Americans, and that does have to be combated, and white American workers included. And I also think too that younger people are just approaching these problems differently, and there's historic reasons for that too. But and I think, sorry, I'm taking a long time on this question, but as these fights unfold over and over again, people are going to respond differently. So like they're going on strike now, and they may win a little, they might lose a little, but the stakes are getting higher. The COVID crisis is one reminder of this, that things are not getting better in this country. And so people are becoming, that's one of the reasons why people are becoming more open to very different solutions than what they're used to. And I think that part of the reason why younger people are more interested in this is because they have less wealth personally to weather the storm. I mean, they can see that, they are accumulating more debt. They don't have the same kind of, again, and this is young white people largely, they don't have the same kind of housing equity that their parents had or their grandparents had. And they're looking at the fact that the ecological crises are real. Like the fires in California, like you can see the smoke in the sky in Connecticut and in Europe apparently too. But
here too, yeah, it's the nighttime dusk. You can see like a red haze last week. It's coming.
Yeah, same thing here. Yeah. So I think that is, and that's the fundamental thing. It's not. I mean, people like me and you going out and talking to people about socialism, that's essential, because without developing an idea that there is an alternative, people are going to end up going towards more conspiracy theories and really kind of mystical ideas about how the world works and how change happens. Right. But it's not us who fundamentally creates the radicalization. It's capitalism itself forces people into a position where they have to start seeking out different answers.
Right. That's interesting. What are the so first of all, what was that book you mentioned about African Americans and finance capital?
So one is The Color of Money, and the other one is The Color of Law. And yeah, that's
okay.
Different authors.
Now, what are the demographics of the district you're running in? I think of New Haven as an insurance capital, an insurance city. Sorry,
Hartford. Yeah, and it's less so than it used to be. Where I live, it's a funny district. I mean, it's probably a good example of gerrymandering. I don't exactly know how all the mechanics work, but there's kind of 2.5 neighborhoods, or it's really like half of one neighborhood, quarter of another, a tenth of another. Where I live immediately it's a mixture of like working class, Black and Latino families, and then some college students, some like recent college graduates, kind of some more artist types, that kind of thing. That's the west end of Hartford. And then there's the Upper Albany area, which is very much, that's a Black ghetto. I mean, I use that term consciously as to mean it's a neighborhood that where people have a hard time leaving if they want to, right?
Right.
And then there's this area of Asylum Hill that's also a little bit more of a mixture, but and then there's also quite a few rich people in one corner of the West End. It's like the Secretary of State lives there, and it's got some old mansions. They have a zoning ordinance where you can't have people who are not, you can't have more than like 2 or 3 people who are not related to each other living in the same mansion.
Yeah.
Anyhow, so it's definitely a hodgepodge kind of district, but I would bet it's majority, like the rest of the city, it still is majority Black and Latino.
Okay. Now, is Hartford a city, does it have much of a suburban area, or is it a city where you abruptly go out into the countryside?
Oh yeah, there are suburbs. Yeah,
Okay.
yeah. I mean, Connecticut sort of, I think, is kind of pioneered a lot of the suburban urban divide the rest of the country picked up.
All right, that's interesting. Now, you were the campaign manager for Fred Link, and he ran for, if I remember, was it the Senate? In
Yes.
2018, was it? And if I remember, he got enough signatures to get on the ballot, but they illegally disqualified him anyway.
So it wasn't quite so. I mean, they didn't put it in those terms blatantly, but we needed 7,500 signatures. We collected 11,000. At the same time, there were candidates for governor that also needed 7,500, and they got fewer signatures than they got on the ballot. The way it works is you're able to look and see why they ruled off certain signatures. And so we went, but it's very difficult because you have to go to the Secretary of State's office, which closes at 4, and you have to make copies, and the copy center closes at 3, and et cetera, et cetera. But we found, they were ruling people off because they were registered as Democrats or Republicans, and that's not a reason to rule somebody off. Because they were registered as unaffiliated. That's what it was, because they ruled people off because they hadn't voted in a while, and that's not a reason to rule people off. They ruled people off who were registered. And, the problem we ran into was they delayed letting us know how many signatures were validated until very close to the end. And we did not have ourselves together to organize a real legal political offensive. We did, have a pretty good political open offensive on this. And we did go in for 2 or 3 weeks showing that signatures were valid that they said were not. We couldn't quite make it over the line. It was a matter of a couple hundred signatures, I believe. Right. So it's one of these cases where I think, it definitely, they were ruling us off either because they didn't care about our rights enough to actually put us on, or because they really wanted to keep us off. Combination of those two things. But I also think that this kind of situation should be viewed as a measure of our organization as a opposition tendency, and that as the socialist movement gets more organized, it's going to be harder to rule us off in that kind of way. Well, I mean, they always can, right? They always can decide to do that, but we can force them to suffer graver political consequences for doing so.
Right. Would it be accurate to say that the people who restricted your ballot access were primarily Democrats?
I'm not familiar with the whole nomination structure. My impression is that actually, okay. So the way I'm sorry, this is a little Byzantine, but the town clerks who validate the actual signatures, they often turn it over to registrars of voters who are elected as members of their party. So it was mostly Democrats who were ruling our signatures off, mostly in Hartford. Cities like Hartford, New Haven, New London, those were major centers of on validation. Actually, this campaign, we were almost ruled off because they lost 7 of our petition sheets. And I was on the verge of filing a press release and having a lawyer begin a legal case. And then they called me and they said, "Oh, we just found them." So,
Oh, okay.
and I was escalating because I had receipts and images and everything, and they lost one of the sheets that had my own signature on it. I started telling them these things like, you realize like how obvious this is, what's going on here. So it's never exactly. It's an unaccountable bureaucracy. So you feel like you're entering into some kind of just rabbit hole when you start thinking about exactly what they're thinking when they do this stuff. But yeah, it's mostly Democratic Party appointed people or elected people. Yeah.
Interesting. Okay, now you're on the ballot now.
Yes.
Excellent. Okay, good, good. Okay, now one more question. What any comments on we're entering the presidential election in about what, a month to 2 months? Biden versus Trump. Any thoughts on that?
So this is going to be a very difficult period because Trump is so terrifying in everything that he says and does, and people are going to feel an enormous pressure to vote for Biden, who is without question a career racist who was a major central opponent of busing for desegregation, was a central architect of the state of mass incarceration that we find ourselves in today, with the 1994 crime bill being one of his key achievements. He comes from you think about it, like one of the border states, and the Democratic Party has always pretty much as a rule, its presidential candidates include someone from a slave state and someone from the North, it's to kind of combine their various historic traditions. And Biden is kind of he's the example of someone coming from effectively a slave state, and not that that's like a huge difference from a northern state, but he does come from the kind of the Jim Crow traditions of this country. That's with no question. And Kamala Harris is a prosecutor who has made her career enforcing the new Jim Crow. Right. But most importantly, whatever offensive comes down the pike after the election, whether it's organized by Trump or by the Democrats or a combination of the two, whatever offensive that is, the power it's going to take to defeat that must be masses of working and oppressed people, and it will have the strength to oppose that offensive, depending upon how independent it is from the ruling class of one layer or another. Right. I think a very good example is this summer. So I think the two clear examples are Trump wanted to bring in the military and the National Guard to crush the mass demonstrations against police brutality in this country. Mm-hmm. And the military apparatus itself, the CIA, George W. Bush, all of these figures opposed using the National Guard and the military.
I remember that after Trump made his speech, his stunt in Lafayette Square, the Episcopal Church in D.C., he was going to invoke the Insurrection Act. There were a flurry of sort of bizarre, maybe woke memos and messages from the Army High Command. That was a little weird. That was a little strange.
Including Mad Dog Mattis.
Yeah, exactly. It
was one of the most right-wing appointments that Trump made.
Yeah.
And so why were they doing why is Mad Dog Mattis coming out to the left of Trump on this? Well, I think if you want to look at a clear example of why, there was a video of Keke Palmer, who I didn't know this when I saw the video at first, but she's a celebrity, coming from her childhood TV days. And she was speaking to National Guardsmen, trying to convince them to join the demonstrations. And this is the kind of thing that gives the ruling class nightmares, because the military is 44% Black and Latino, and some percentage of the white troops are not total reactionary. They're not joining, and so there was a real danger, I think, that because this movement was so popular and because people kept demonstrating and refused to go back home, that there was a real danger in the ruling class's eyes that the military would split over trying to repress this thing. And then also, and the CIA said this quite explicitly, CIA veterans, they were also worried what this would do to the image of the United States around the world, because the US is an imperialist power, and its power depends upon not just hard power, but soft power in every country on the planet. So that's why the generals were like, this is a terrible idea. I mean, Trump was just being an amateur.
Yeah.
He looked at Occupy and he said, man, when Obama crushed Occupy, it just disappeared. But what he didn't pay attention to is the fact that Obama waited, months for Occupy to kind of get worn down. And then he, organized all the local mayors. He didn't do it himself. He didn't send in the military. He got the local mayors to put the kibosh on it in a coordinated fashion. And also, Occupy was far weaker than this mobile. I mean, it's totally different categories.
Right.
So Trump was being in, but also there were Democrats like Ilhan Omar who told people at that time, that same weekend when Trump was preparing the military and the National Guard, Ilhan Omar and other Democrats were going around telling everybody to get back home, just steer clear of the National Guard, let them do what they're going to do, and let people like her make systematic change. And people just didn't listen to them. They just kept going.
Yeah.
And so that's the first example. The second would be that by June 14th, there was this whole mass push towards Black trans lives matter. It was culminating in a major demonstration in Brooklyn. And the next day, the Supreme Court comes out with this ruling against employment discrimination for trans and gay workers.
Direct action gets the goods.
Yeah, and could that have possibly been some coincidence that in the midst of the largest mobilizations in American history, the Supreme Court makes this decision? And not only that, but the person who wrote the decision was Trump's first Supreme Court nominee. So, it shows that it's not like, having someone who's more enlightened in the Supreme Court, that's not our field. That's not what we don't have the power to affect that, and that doesn't actually change our lives. What changes our lives is if we are independently mobilizing in the streets. Direct action, but especially mass action. I mean, I think there was this real danger, again, in the ruling class's mind that, oh my God, they already have a movement against police brutality and for African American liberation. If they tie this to trans rights, gay rights, I mean, the kind of damage that would do to the ability of the ruling class to keep a lid on things would be really extreme. So I think they said we have to give them something to kind of take the steam out of this new movement. And they did. I mean, the Black Trans Lives Matter, that disappeared, not because it was repressed, but because there was a victory.
Okay, co-opted in a way. That's interesting. Where do you see the current wave of protests, the Black Lives Matter protest, going? Do you see it dying out? Do you see it continuing or expanding into other areas?
I think at the moment it's going to be weaker than it has been because of the elections, because so many forces involved in this movement are now orienting towards electing Biden.
Sucking away the movement, yeah.
Yeah, and they're afraid of embarrassing him. I mean, people for a long time, there's been layers who've been afraid of the Black Lives Matter protests because they're afraid it will make it hard to elect Biden, either because it will make him look bad or because it will make him look too radical by association or something like that. Whatever. It's all of these reasons are bad reasons, but it's a reminder that it's not just that people change their efforts from going in the streets to supporting the Democrats. They also become afraid that if they're in the streets, that effort will get in the way of electing the Democrats. Anyhow, so I think in the next couple of months, it's going to be a weaker movement. I think the fact that there has not been a mass explosion over the failure to indict police who killed Breonna Taylor in a significant way beyond shooting a wall, I think that does show that the movement has been undermined by the elections. However, I think the radicalization is far deeper than just a few month long outburst. This time around, people started raising real demands. New leadership formed everywhere, and those leaders have not disappeared. Some of them are still going. I mean, it's in Connecticut, there are people who are still demonstrating, organizing demonstrations, who were new leaders who started organizing for the first time around this mobilization, and they haven't yet gotten on the Biden train, at least to the point where it stopped their mobilizations. And so I think it's going to continue. I think it will perhaps die down for a while, but the discussions will keep going, and I think it's going to burst out again. I think the questions are, what kind of organizations are going to come out of this? What kind of conclusions are people going to draw about the need for being independent of the Democratic Party and other establishment institutions and pieces of the apparatus? And exactly what kinds of political orientations are they going to take? Is it going to be some kind of radical reformism? Is it going to be for independent Black action? And I can't say I have an answer there. I think there's lots of ways this can go.
Right, interesting. Any thoughts about who's going to win, Bush or Biden? Somewhat, but it's up in the air right now.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, I think it could go either way for all kinds of reasons, and I think those who want to organize something independent should be prepared for both of those eventualities, including many different extreme scenarios.
Right, interesting. Now, one more question. How do you relate to other left groups? Like, I don't know if you consider the Green Party a leftist group, or if they have a presence in Connecticut, or other socialist organizations. Is there much of a presence of other socialist groups in Connecticut? And do you work with them, or how do you relate to them?
There isn't the same kind of collection of socialist groups in Connecticut as there are in places where there's one central metro area. There's also more in the southern portion of the state. I mean, nationwide, my group is in the Revolutionary Socialist Network, right, which includes a number of ex-ISOers. It also includes Workers' Voice. But then also, I mean, even if I'm not involved in a kind of project like the Revolutionary Socialist Network, which I view as a real, and I believe the rest of the people in this grouping view as part of a long-term effort towards a regroupment of the socialist left in the United States. But in addition to that kind of project, which is, I think, a bit more narrow but serious, I do work with other socialist tendencies on United Front work. During the movement against the war in Iraq, that was part of my everyday life, was working with other socialist groups. There hasn't been something that has united people around the state in the same way in a while. Although actually, except for the COVID crisis has got me working with people in the DSA and other ex-ISOers around immigrant rights work. Yeah, I mean, and Green Party people. I mean, I'll work with Green Party people on United Front action, like around a specific cause, like stopping the kidnapping of activists or stopping a war. But we don't, and we will support other socialist candidates in running in an independent socialist party, but we don't support Green Party candidates because we view it as a dead end. I mean, I personally view the Green Party as, it's got some good people in it. I would like them to leave the Green Party and help build an actual socialist movement or an actual working class movement. The Green Party has got way too many right-wing tendencies, conspiracy theorists, or just confused, kind of middle-class orientations that are afraid of directly challenging capitalist power, don't have confidence in working class power. And I hate to speak so poorly of another group like this, but I think if there's any time when it makes sense to abandon the Green Party project, it's now, when people are interested in socialism and completely unprecedented ways.
Mhm. Interesting. Is Socialist Resurgence endorsing like Howie Hawkins or Gloria La Riva or anyone running for president? Or
We're not endorsing Howie Hawkins. In the past, the party that we came out of did endorse Gloria La Riva
right?
along with other socialist candidates. I think it is made more complicated. It was always a critical endorsement. I think it's made a bit more complicated this time by the fact that she called for a vote for Sanders during the primaries.
Right.
And so, from our perspective, is that if it's not an independent socialist campaign, I'm not even sure that like a critical endorsement is really that useful.
Mhm.
So we haven't actually had a full discussion on this yet.
Okay.
But yeah, it's harder this time, I gotta say, to find someone to endorse.
Right. Interesting. Now, Socialist Resurgence split from Socialist Action about a year ago. Is there anything you'd care to add about that, or heard it was kind of a mess?
Well, I mean, it was a mess when we were in it. I think it was great. The leaving was
Right.
quite positive. I mean, it was. I mean, yeah, leaving actually gave me an extraordinary confidence in the people I
Oh,
was working with
okay.
because. So I mean, splits are just as much a part of building a revolutionary movement as fusions are, and you know, when I was in Socialist Action, and before I was in Socialist Action, it made many important contributions. And there were, I mean, there were immediate organizational problems. There were, there were a variety of kind of secondary political problems that were very important, but still secondary to the central cause. But I think that I'm sorry, I'm speaking very abstractly because
Hmm.
it's this a lot. But the point I'm trying to make is that, but there are real objective reasons why these things happen. So in the case of socialist action, I would submit, and history may or may not prove me right or wrong, that the big reasons why that party degenerated was the creation of Chinese and Russian imperialism and the years of defeats of both the workers' movement and the socialist movement, leading to a certain kind of pessimism, um, and and especially a sort of international isolation. I mean, socialists like we're the international that we have historically been in has not only gone through its own kind of degeneration, but has acted in a very fragmented way. So, like I said at the beginning about socialism, it stems from the objective fact that everything is made by working people around the world. The only vantage point you can have to make a revolution or to fight for socialism is a worldwide vantage point, and worldwide from the vantage point of the working class. And when you lose confidence in that, you're going to start looking for other actors to solve that problem for you. And I think people in socialist action started looking to Russia largely, to a certain extent China, and then also to the national capitalist class of poor countries to sort of do the work of the working class. And that's that's kind of a brainful right there, but that comes from objective conditions. I mean that's like it's a change in the world. You're confronted with these changes in the world. You're confronted with the fact that the working class in the United States has been largely inactive for a long time, and uh, you'll follow that. I mean that kind of problem. People are going to interpret that situation differently, I guess is where I'm going with that. And uh, so I believe that's what happened. Now there were some secondary factors there, which were also which were extremely unfortunate. So for instance, if you're viewing Russia as not an imperialist country, but as like a poor beleaguered country, you might take some of the right-wing movements that are circulating around Russia less seriously. You might view them as not as dangerous as they are. And I think that also started happening within some of the people in that group, I believe one of whom has since left. And so with that, we also saw a pretty nasty strain of transphobia in the group as well.
Okay, I've heard about that.
Yeah. And I think that also, so there was like the immediate cause, right? But then I think also we started reading documents from the SWP in the 70s over the debate, because there was a debate over the gay rights movement, gay and lesbian rights movement, and some of the things that came up in that debate, they were quite horrifying. And what apparently the way that debate went was sort of this agreement to disagree. So you had some people who were joining big organizations to fight for gay rights, and they were allowed to do this, but it wasn't like a party project per se. And so in some branches, people were doing this work, and in other branches, they were discouraged from doing this work. And I'm sorry, this is a long narrative I just got into there. But I think for the consequences of the mistakes made in that debate in the 70s, I think were felt again in socialist action in the teens. Like it started, like there were unresolved questions that had never really been worked through, and that also came to a head. Mm-hmm. I'm sorry, it's a huge thing. You just don't, yeah.
But you got former SWP members who are a bit old school and some social attitudes. Okay, it's interesting. Now, finally, is there anything you'd like to add? And also, how can people help your campaign? Help or contribute to your campaign?
I think I've said a lot, so I think I won't add anything. But you can go to piper4connecticut.nationbuilder.com to make a donation. If you're in state, it can be up to $250, I believe. If you're out of state, it's $200. But it says there on the website. And if you're in Connecticut, we're going door knocking on a regular basis now, and talking to people is amazing. Maybe that's the other thing to add. Is just that it really is. It's people really want to talk politics. They want to talk about what's going on in the world and what to do about it. And again, are generally interested in socialists. And then also we are looking for people to help us out with phone banking too. So anybody anywhere could help us out with the phone banking.
Okay.
Yeah.
They can reach you through that link you mentioned?
Yes, they can. Yeah, they can sign up to volunteer through that link. Yes.
Okay, great. Well, I want to thank you very much, and I wish you good luck.
Thank you so much, Caitlin. This has been a great opportunity, great interview.
Thanks. Okay, I'll edit it, and I should have it online in a few days, a day or two.
Great. Thanks a lot, Caitlin.
Thank you. Good luck.
Thanks. Take care.
Bye-bye.
Bye.